Hello, everyone. It's great to see you out this evening. I know a lot of people like to go home a little early or go out for drinks and dinner, but I really appreciate you coming by for this because I think we're going to have some fun. So I'm Kyle, and today we're talking about the Boeing 737 MAX, a plane that had some issues a couple years back, 2018, 2019, that you may have read about in the news before COVID took over. And when I was preparing for today, I was trying to come up with a little bit of a spicier title for my talk, something a little more suitable for a keynote. So maybe we have this, right, 737 MAX, when humans and technology don't mix. Or maybe the 737 MAX, how to irreparably damage your company in 3 easy steps. Whichever one you like most, let me know. How to get a $62 million CEO retirement package. The 737 MAX, it takes 102 years to build a reputation, but only 2 crashes and a door falling off your plane in midair to destroy it. Or maybe the 737 MAX, oh God, please make it stop. So a little bit about me. I studied in aerospace engineering at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, where I completed my PhD in that field. Aerospace, of course, being aeronautics and astronautics, aircraft and spacecraft, which is why I'm pretty interested in topics like the 737. And after that, I went off and started my own company that focuses on technologies that really integrate humans operating with complex systems and how we design those for them to work effectively. And we're headquartered in the beautiful city of Ottawa, Canada. It is beautiful in the summer right now. It is not so nice in the winter. So we're talking about things to consider, right? I'm not giving you specific directions about what you should or should not do when you're designing systems. Instead, I'm telling you about some things that we need to think about and make conscious decisions about when we do that. And we're also talking about life-critical systems. Life-critical, of course, meaning anything that can, if it fails, cost a human life, or if it doesn't work properly, cost a human life. And I think we might have some people in the audience saying, okay, that's not really what I do. I do web development, I do financial technology, something else. But I would argue with that, and I would say that more people here have worked on a life-critical system than you might think, because it encompasses a lot of different domains. We, of course, have aerospace, right? Everything on an aircraft or spacecraft that controls propulsion, navigation, aerodynamics, et cetera, of course, are all life-critical, because if they fail, the plane cannot fly. But also, consider something as simple as the entertainment system in the back of the seat. You're watching your movie on the way over the ocean. And for me, it was Moana 2. But consider if there's a failure in there and the electronics short circuit and it starts a fire. All of a sudden, you have this very simple entertainment system that has become life critical because that will take down an aircraft. And we see that across a number of different domains. So in telecommunications, we don't often consider this or think of this as life critical, but it really, really is, because these are essential for life-saving services. If this fails, you can no longer call 112 or 911 for us in North America. In a lot of countries, people use their phones to call a pharmacy and order their essential medications for delivery. Even if they're not having a medical emergency, they're going to if they can't get their meds. Self-driving cars, really big topic these days, and a very excellent example of how anything you touch, anything you work on, is life-critical, because any of the algorithms running on these computers, if they fail, can of course cause the car to do something that will hurt someone. Healthcare is a huge field for this, because it's not just the medical robots that we're seeing and IV pumps and things like that, but also if you work on something as simple as handling medical records. If your system fails, and that record is no longer available when a physician needs it, they can't look up a person's allergies, they give a medication that the person's allergic to, well, now your record system is life critical. And I also want to note that what we're talking about here, I try to keep it light and add some jokes and make it fun as the evening talk, but it's not theory, right? Like, we are talking about some serious events that killed a lot of people, and so we need to keep in mind how important these things really are. And when I first started giving this talk, I also used to say that I'm not assigning blame to anyone here because I didn't want to get sued by Boeing. But since then, the final accident investigation reports have been released, some court things have happened, and we can definitively say it is Boeing's fault. / the FAA's fault, which we'll get to in a little bit. So let's talk about what actually happened here so we have some context. So we had two flights. The first flight, Lion Air Flight 610 in October of 2018. And this flight crashed into the Java Sea at just off the coast of Indonesia at least 560 kilometers per hour. I say at least because that's the last recorded speed. It was probably going much, much faster when it actually hit, but that data was lost in the impact. And this killed all 189 passengers and crew on board the aircraft. And then we had our second flight, Ethiopian Airlines Flight 302 in March of 2019, which crashed into the ground at 926 kilometers per hour and killed all 157 passengers and crew. Note how little time there is between these, because that will be important. In terms of the consequences of these events, well, the 737 MAX was grounded around the world several days after the second crash. It took them several days to decide to do that before they actually implemented that. 387 aircraft were grounded, which affected 59 different airlines. 8,600 flights per week had to be canceled. And this grounded the aircraft for 20 months. And so that's the economic impact. But from a policy perspective, this resulted in an audit of how the FAA actually regulated these aircraft and evaluated them for safety. Because theoretically, the FAA had said, yes, this is a safe aircraft. There shouldn't be any issues. Clearly, they were wrong. What happened? Can we trust them? And that applies in a global context as well, because up until this point, most regulatory bodies, such as in the EU and in Canada, said, okay, this aircraft is made in the US, the FAA is in the US, they're fairly reliable, we're going to trust them if they say that this is safe, and we will let it fly in our country. Clearly, they were wrong to do that. So now we have a question of, do we keep trusting them? Or do we have to do our own evaluation by every different country of every new aircraft? And the overhead for that is enormous. In terms of financial impact, $8.6 billion that Boeing had to pay out to the airlines who had to lose all those flights because of those issues. $5 billion in unusual costs of production. That means they had to fix a bunch of their mistakes. $6.3 billion in increased costs of the program. That's probably legal fees, other fixes, and trying to get back their customers. $600 million in aircraft storage fees. $500 million paid out to the families of the victims of those flights. $2.5 billion settlement for fraud charges that were brought against them. And $60 billion in lost sales. Now that last one is important because that makes up a massive portion of Boeing's revenue and almost tanked the company. Finally, $100 million in lost income for the pilots who were supposed to be flying those flights. And this one is particularly interesting because even though it's the smallest number on there, it may have actually had the largest impact in some ways. Because particularly in this industry, the greatest way to drive change is to piss off one of the most powerful unions in the industry. Let's look at a timeline. How did we get to this point? The power of my voice. So 2006, Boeing decides to do a clean sheet replacement of the 737. Now the 737 is a legendary aircraft. It first flew in the 1960s, so at this point it had been flying for almost 40 years, and they said, you know, that's probably enough. We've done three different generations of this at this point. We're going to do a new design. But several years later, Airbus launched the A320neo. Neo stands for New Engine Option. And the A320 was an aircraft that was quite popular, and so this was an updated version of it that was more efficient. And what's interesting about the A320neo is that it fills the same market space as the 737 MAX. It's a similar size, same passenger capacity, similar range, and so it's a direct competitor. And the following year, the A320neo set a record for how many aircraft they sold at a single air show. And this really grabbed Boeing's attention because it made them aware that this could really be a market killer for them. And so the following month, something else happens. American Airlines orders 260 of the A320neos. And what's interesting here is that up until this point, American Airlines was exclusively a Boeing company. They only flew Boeing aircraft because it's easier for logistics and training and maintenance. So the A320neo was so appealing in terms of a cost-effectiveness perspective that it was worth breaking that exclusivity in order to buy it. But at the same time, American Airlines said, well, we still like the 737. We have a bunch of pilots trained on it. We want to keep using it. So Boeing, can you please give us some new 737s that have new engines on them, the same way that Airbus has done theirs? So Boeing says, okay, well, we have to design a new version of this anyway that has these new engines on it, so let's just abandon our plan to create a new aircraft and we'll do a fourth generation of the 737. We're really going to push it a little beyond its expected lifespan here. And in 2016, the A320neo has its first revenue flight, its first paying passengers. And the following year, the 737 does the same. So Boeing really did manage to almost meet their objective of coming out to market at the same time as Airbus, because the year and a half here is pretty small in terms of airlines. So they managed to get something into the market and remain competitive. Now we're talking a lot about engines here and engine efficiency, and that is important because more efficient engines are larger. These are called high bypass engines, which means that the fan that is driven by the engine moves a lot of air around the outside of the engine instead of through the combustion chamber. When we look at the original design of the 737, we can see that the original engine, the classic Pratt & Whitney JT8D, had a diameter of 1.25 meters, fairly small. By the time we get to the third generation of the 737 in 1997, we have an engine that has a diameter of 1.83 meters. And when we look at the 737 MAX, we have an engine with a diameter of 2.26. So these things have gotten steadily larger because that's more fuel efficient as you're able to design that. So the question here is, how do you fit an engine that is almost twice the diameter of the original design on an airframe that hasn't really changed at all? And the answer is you can't really, because it wasn't designed for that. And if you just bolted it on underneath the wing, it would be dragging on the ground during takeoff. So instead, Boeing says, let's take that engine and we're going to shift it forward and up. And that allows us to mount it further off the ground so that it has the ground clearance that it needs while we have that larger engine. And we can really see that in detail when we compare specifications of the different versions. We have the original, the third generation, and the MAX, the fourth generation here. And we can see just how much that engine has been shifted forward on the wing in order to create that ground clearance. But the problem with this is that the casings of the engine, called the nacelles, actually generate lift when air moves underneath them. And by shifting them further forward, you've shifted the center of lift of your aircraft further forward, which causes the nose to want to pitch up under certain situations. And these are different, what we call handling characteristics. It feels different to the pilot when they're flying it, which makes it harder for the pilot to be able to control it effectively. And so Boeing's test pilots, when they were trying this out, said, this is not okay. We're not going to allow this. And so Boeing had to try to make some corrections. And they tried to fix it in hardware. They tried to make some aerodynamic changes to the aircraft. It was unsuccessful, so they fixed it in software instead. And that is how we get MCAS, which is the Maneuvering Characteristics Augmentation System. Or, as I think some engineer in Boeing probably said, we'll fix it in post. So let's look at MCAS and see how that actually works. So on your aircraft, on the nose, on each side, you have what's called an angle of attack sensor. And it's this little sensor here that measures the angle of the airflow past the aircraft relative to the position of the aircraft. It is different than measuring pitch because pitch has to do with gravity and this has to do with airflow, but it's a similar concept. And that sensor reads the motion or the angle of attack and sends that data into a flight control computer. Like so. On that flight control computer is the algorithm called MCAS, and MCAS, when it realizes that an aircraft is doing that pitch up that it shouldn't be, sends a signal to the electric motor that drives the stabilizer. It rotates the stabilizer back, which brings the nose of the aircraft down. These animations are lifted from a documentary by Netflix called Downfall. Kind of a clever name in a couple ways there, but a fairly accurate documentary if you're interested. So let's kind of put together a systems diagram of this to see how these things play together. We have our angle of attack sensors on the nose, like so. And we have two flight control computers on a 737. Only one of them is active at a time, and the other is a backup that the pilots can switch to if there's an issue with the primary. Each of the two angle of attack sensors is connected to one of the two flight control computers. So the one on the pilot side is connected to the pilot side flight control computer, and vice versa. And on the computers, we have the MCAS algorithm. Only one of them is active at a time. And these drive the electric motor that rotates the stabilizer at the back of the aircraft. Like so. That brings the nose of the aircraft down, which counteracts the effect that the test pilots noticed where the aircraft wanted to pitch up of its own accord. So we'll take a little pause from these specific issues to talk about something in aircraft called type ratings. A type rating is what allows a pilot to fly a certain category of aircraft. And to get a type rating is a pretty intensive process. So after you've already got your pilot's license, to get a specific type rating, you have to go through ground school to be trained on that specific aircraft. You have to do a lot of time in a simulator. These simulators are millions of dollars usually. You have to do an oral exam in front of a panel, and you have to do a check ride where an instructor is evaluating your performance to make sure that you are flying that aircraft properly. And so this is very both time-consuming and very expensive in terms of materials here. And in addition to the pilot's time, when they're doing this training, they're also not flying for the airline. So the airline has to bring in other pilots to backfill for them, making this even more costly. So airlines don't want to do this if they can avoid it, which is why they like to keep buying new generations of existing aircraft. So the A330, for example, is a type rating. And the A320 is also a type rating. Now, within a type rating, we have what are called variants. Right? So the A319, A320, A321, these are all variants within that type rating. And a variant is called a variant because it is essentially the same aircraft with very minor variations on it. So here we see the cockpit of two different aircraft, the A319 and the A321, and we can see that they're almost identical in how they're configured, if not actually identical, which means that a pilot can hop out of one and into the other and fly it without really needing to know much about the differences. And when they do need to become certified to fly a different variant, it's pretty much just a 1-hour session on an iPad to learn some specifics about range, weight, etc., and that's about it. So airlines like this. It's low cost, low time commitment, and it makes your pilots very flexible if you can keep most of your aircraft within one type rating. So one of the things that made the A320neo so popular and appealing was that it fell under the same type rating as the older A320s, which meant that airlines could buy this and have their pilots fly it with very little training required, which saves them a lot of time. So when Boeing, which also has a type rating for the 737, when they said, well, we're going to try to make a competing product, in order for it to truly compete in the market, it would also have to be within the same type rating as their existing 737s. But there was a problem with this, and that's that MCAS is a new control system. And a new control system means you need different training, and different training means you get a different type rating, and a different type rating means it's no longer competitive in the market, and this makes Boeing very sad. Because Airbus is going to take off in the market, and they'll be left behind. But Boeing and some very creative management there had an idea about how to solve this. Their solution was, don't tell anyone about MCAS. Because if you don't know about MCAS, then you don't need training on MCAS. And if you don't need the training, it's the same training as the older 737. If it's the same training, it's the same type rating. If it's the same type rating, it's a competitive aircraft. And this makes Boeing very happy. Because now they have introduced something competitive into the market in a short timeline. Now, we know this, like this is not guesswork about why they did this, and I'm going to be showing a number of quotes through the rest of the presentation here from a newspaper called the Seattle Times. You might know that Boeing was historically headquartered in Seattle, Washington, and they've moved their headquarters since then, but their manufacturing facilities are still primarily in Seattle. So the Seattle Times has a long and colorful history of covering Boeing, and actually won a Pulitzer Prize for its coverage of a previous generation of the 737. So that's why we use them as a source. So Boeing decided the 737 pilots needed no extra training on the system. They didn't even need to know about it. It was not mentioned in their flight manuals. Now, there is a caveat to this. It was technically mentioned in the flight manuals. MCAS, the acronym, was defined in the glossary, even though it was not used in the text anywhere. Because it was there, and then someone said, that's going to cause problems, and they ripped it out, but they forgot to remove it from the glossary. Now that stance allowed the jet to earn a common type rating with the other 737 models, which allowed airlines to minimize the training. So essentially a recap of what we just said. And Boeing's CEO said essentially the same thing. MCAS is fundamentally embedded in the handling qualities of the airplane. It is not a separate system that needs to be trained on. And a little spoiler alert here for you going forward, Mr. Muhlenberg is no longer the CEO of Boeing. And as we mentioned about the type rating and variants, training on moving from the older 737 to the new one consisted of no more than a 1-hour session on an iPad, and no simulator was required. Now, no simulator was required, which is true, but some customers did actually want a simulator because they thought it would be valuable to have their pilots train on it. Or maybe they were buying new simulators anyways and they wanted them to be the more recent version. Either way, Boeing didn't like that. And we have a copy of a quote from a Boeing employee that was sent in a text message that came out during a court case, I think, or the investigation. Now friggin' Lion Air might need a sim to fly the MAX, and maybe because of their own stupidity, I'm scrambling to trying to figure out how to unscrew this now, idiots. This was sent from one Boeing employee to another, and they're talking about Lion Air asking for a simulator here. Now, obviously, this is not a great way to talk about your customers, particularly when your text messages are subject to a subpoena. But does anyone notice the name of the airline here, right? Lion Air is the airline that had the first crash. So let's talk about manual overrides, because we're talking about automation, so we should talk about humans can interfere with the automation or stop it. The MCAS system, or sorry, the trim system, I should say, does have manual control. So on the yokes, we have these little switches that toggle up or down to rotate the stabilizer. They control the same electric motor that MCAS does. And this is how the pilots would manually adjust the trim of the aircraft. Down here, we have stabilizer trim cutout switches. These are simple toggle switches that, if you turn them off, they disable the electric motor entirely, so it cannot rotate the stabilizer. And here we have the manual trim wheel, which is an actual wheel that is mechanically linked to the stabilizer. So it is a direct mechanical connection. It cannot be shut off, and there is no automation to help with it. No power assist. It has a little handle that flips out from the side, and you crank the wheel. And if we put these onto our systems diagram, our trim control sits somewhere in here because it sends the signal into the flight control computer, which then controls the stabilizer motor. Our trim cutout switches are somewhere over here because they disable the signal going to the motor altogether. And our manual trim wheels are a separate system that is mechanically linked and cannot be disabled. Let's talk about the first flight in particular, Lion Air 610. First, I want to start with a little video that shows part of the accident investigation. After an aircraft hits the water at these speeds, there's very little remaining, and that makes the investigation extremely difficult because trying to recover all these and then reconstruct them is an extremely time-intensive process, an expensive process, and oftentimes a lot of these have sunk to a part of the ocean that you can't reach. So these investigations are based off of what can be recovered, but also some, we'll say, best estimates about what might have happened. So what happened on this flight? Well, from the data that was recovered, we think that the angle of attack sensor broke. There we go. Angle of attack sensor broke, or was faulty when it was installed, or something was wrong with it and it was sending invalid data. And that caused MCAS to think that the plane was pitched up far too high. And if we recall, the whole purpose of MCAS is to compensate for when the plane tries to pitch itself up. So MCAS sees this data and it activates. It says, that is what I was born to do, let me fly. And it sends a signal to the stabilizer motor, which rotates it and causes the nose of the aircraft to come back down. The pilots noticed this happening and tried to compensate for it by using their toggle switches to control the trim and bring the nose back up. But the issue here is that MCAS operates in a 10-second on, 5-second off cycle. So for 10 seconds, it will activate that motor and rotate the stabilizer, and then for 5 seconds, it will pause and evaluate the results to see if it needs to continue or if the issue has been addressed. During those 10 seconds, MCAS is in control. And then during the 5-second pause, the pilots were able to use their toggle switches to control the motor. So you had 10 seconds on, 5 seconds off. And so you have this battle going back and forth between the automation and the human trying to control the aircraft. But eventually the pilots panic. They cannot understand what is going on, why the aircraft is doing the opposite of what they're trying to do. And they lose that battle and it goes into an unrecoverable dive. And we can see this in graph form here. This is a graph showing the altitude and the speed of the flight compared to a normal flight below. And we see that shortly into flight, there's a sudden drop in altitude that the pilots quickly recover from because they're pulling back on that stick as hard as they can when they notice the plane trying to drop itself to the ground. And then we see this oscillation pattern where the plane is going up and down because that is that battle happening where they're going back and forth with the automation. And then eventually towards the end, we see them start to dive quickly where it became unrecoverable. Now, after this, Boeing and the FAA got together and said, what might have happened? We think we know what happened, but we're not going to fully state what happened. Instead, we are going to tell pilots how to deal with it if it happens again. And they published an airworthiness directive, which is a statement that goes out that all pilots who are allowed to fly that aircraft have to read before they fly the aircraft, so that they know of potential issues and how to deal with them. So their directive said that if this issue happens, disengage the autopilot and control the airplane pitch with the control column, so pull back on the stick, and maintain the electric trim with those toggle switches as required. If you relax the column and the trim still moves on its own, set the stabilizer trim cutout switch to cutout, right? So you disable that electronic system altogether. And if it's still an issue, use the manual wheel and crank it to rotate the stabilizer into a stable position. So they're saying, try to pull back on the stick, then try to do it electrically, then disable the automation and do it manually. Now behind the scenes here, like I mentioned, Boeing and the FAA kind of knew what was going on, but they didn't explain here what is going on. But they did release some information after. An internal FAA risk analysis completed a month after the Lion Air crash, and this is before the second crash, last fall estimated that without action to address the jet's faulty control system, it would suffer an average of 1 crash every 3 years during the life of the MAX's worldwide fleet. I did some math on that. These fleets usually have a lifespan of about 45 years. That's 1 crash every 3 years, 15 crashes, 220 passengers each, 160 on average. So that's 2,400 to 3,400 deaths that they estimated would happen from this. And yet they allowed the plane to keep flying. And that is why at the beginning I said this is also the FAA's fault. Let's look at the second flight, Ethiopian Airlines 302. What happened? Essentially the same thing happened. There was a problem with one of the sensors, and we see that same pattern. We see a sudden drop, the pilots fight it and pull up. We see another drop, they pull up, and they're doing this battle. And eventually, it goes into an unrecoverable dive when they lose that battle with the automation. This is what you have to deal with when you're trying to do an investigation on an aircraft that has hit the ground at that speed. Once again, there's very little to recover, and trying to assemble that into something that you can actually investigate is extremely difficult and time-consuming. And not only that, but you have to go excavating for those components because they've been driven quite deep under the ground. Now, a little side tangent here, when I was thinking about this today, about the engineering thought process, because I wanted to try to express, how much energy does that plane actually have when it hits the ground, right? How can I express that in relatable terms? So the plane had about 2.5 gigajoules of energy when it hit the ground. Belgium consumes 9.2 gigawatts of electricity on average. So the crash represents about 0.27 seconds of Belgian electricity usage. And I was like, well, so does that mean that Belgium uses 4 plane crashes worth of energy every second? And then, because I saw the keynote this morning who said, well, you can't have a talk these days without something from generative AI, I said, ChatGPT, make me a graph of the top 7 energy consumers by number of crashes per second of energy consumption. Now, this, I think, is a great example of why if you can do something doesn't necessarily mean you should do something, because representing national energy consumptions in units of crashes per second is unacceptable by anyone's standard. Moving on. So same thing happened here. Erroneous data coming from the angle of attack sensor. Feeding into the flight control computer, MCAS sees that, it says, airplane's pitching up, got to do my job and pitch it back down. So it does that, it rotates the stabilizer, drives the nose of the aircraft down. Except this time, the pilots have read their airworthiness directive and they do what they're supposed to do. They turn that cutout switch to cutout and they disable the electric motor entirely. So now MCAS can no longer rotate the stabilizer. They then try to use their manual trim wheel to rotate the stabilizer back into a stable position to recover control of the aircraft. But there's a problem with this. During takeoff is one of the only times during flight that an aircraft is at full throttle. Usually at cruise, you're at a much lower throttle than that. But because this issue happened shortly after takeoff, the pilots got distracted and didn't think to throttle back. So for this entire time they've been doing this, the aircraft has been at full throttle and is now moving at a very high rate of speed. And because of that, there's an immense amount of air pressure driving against this control surface that is already rotated back fairly far. And so when they are turning that manual control wheel, they can't, because they don't have the physical strength to rotate it against that massive amount of air pressure driving against the stabilizer. And so what they do is they realize this isn't going to work. We can't do this. We need the power assist to be able to rotate the stabilizer. So they re-enable that cutout switch, and try to use their trim switches, which works a little bit. But as soon as they re-enable that switch, MCAS, which has been running in the background the entire time, is able to affect the stabilizer again. It does the same thing and drives the nose down further. And there is where we start, or where we see them drop into the unrecoverable dive, because they didn't expect it to start happening again when they turned that switch back on. So let's recap the events here. We had an existing design that was modified in a way that changed the aerodynamics. They couldn't solve this without a redesign, so they solved it in software. They didn't tell pilots or airlines about it, so they wouldn't have to train on it, and so the pilots don't know what's happening, which leads you to accident number 1, Lion Air Flight 610. The FAA identified the risk of more crashes but did not ground the MAX. Instead, they provided an airworthiness directive with instructions of how to deal with the situation if it happened again, but the pilots were not physically able to follow those instructions, and so we had the second crash. So that completes kind of the summary of the events. Now you understand the story of what happened and how it happened. And so now we can talk about what we learned from this and how we take it into our own fields. The first question to ask is, when do you teach the users about the inner workings of a system? In this case, should the pilots have known about MCAS? Should they have been told and trained on MCAS? And to address this question, let's consider another example. Let's say we have a brand new fancy car, version 1.0, coming out of the factory and being sold to customers. But like many things we release after our main release, version 1.0, we realize quickly, oh, we need a 1.0.1 because there were some bugs there. So this car has a bug, and it has a tendency to just accelerate on its own once in a while. Doesn't matter what you do, it's just going to speed off. Obviously a problem. But we're not going to do a recall because it only affects a small number of users. There are 2 ways you can deal with this issue. Option number 1 is you hold the accelerator pedal at its maximum position for 4 seconds while simultaneously pumping the brakes 3 times at 1-second intervals. You apply the emergency brake at 33% and you release it after 8 seconds. After you release the accelerator, but before you release the emergency brake, activate the 4-way hazard flashers and apply the horn for 3.6 seconds. In order for this to work, you have to do it within 10 seconds of the issue starting. Now, this seems crazy, right? But I will tell you that if you've ever looked at a pilot's checklist, particularly for a commercial airliner or a fighter jet or some other very complex piece of machinery, this is not at all abnormal. And there are procedures just as complicated as this that pilots are expected to be able to do. But this is guaranteed to resolve your issue. If you do it properly, there's a 100% chance of success. And then we have option 2, which is turn off your engine, attempt to maintain control of the vehicle while gradually applying the brakes. That has an 85% chance of success because, well, hopefully there's no corner coming up when you do that. So now let's say we have 2 users. We have average Joe. Okay, he drives to work and back every day. He's a good driver. He passes driving exam, no tickets, but he's not a professional. And we have Speedy Sally, who's an F1 race car driver. And she spends her entire day, every day, training and rehearsing and studying how her vehicle works and what it does. For each of these people, what should we tell them to do? And my argument is that something like this would be most appropriate. Because Sally spends all of her time training, because you can teach her things and she will practice it and memorize it because that's her job, you can give her something much more complex to do. You can give her something that has a higher chance of success or higher performance, even if it is more difficult to do. For someone like Joe, well, even if you could train him on that process, what are the chances he's going to remember it several years later when this issue happens? And what are the chances he's going to do it properly when he's under the stress of that kind of situation, especially for someone who is not trained and experienced in operating under that level of stress? And so these form endpoints on what I call a performance versus required knowledge curve, or performance versus complexity curve, because performance and complexity very often go hand in hand with these types of systems. And sticking with our modes of transportation theme, we'll plot some points on here. So walking, right? Very low performance, but a very low level of complexity. Kids can do it, easy. Riding a bike, higher performance, but a little bit more complex to learn how to do. Driving a car, right? We're moving up the curve, and your race car up near the top here. And we see the same in aircraft as well. Most pilots learn on something fairly small and easy to fly, like a small Cessna, and then you'll move up into your commercial airliners, and then some will move into fighter jets, right? Very high complexity, very high performance pieces of equipment that require more time spent training than you spend operating it. And we see this with other themes as well. If we look at computers, for example, we have my stock 2.8 gigahertz processor, right? Very easy. My grandmother can turn the laptop on and it works, no problem. Versus someone wanting to overclock their CPU. You get more performance out of it, but now you need to learn about thermal management, about voltage regulation, about stability, and all sorts of different things in order to be able to do it. And we see it with something like skis, right? Your small kiddie skis versus powder skis. You have to know about the bindings and how to set them properly and have your edges sharpened all the time. We see it in a Mac computer versus a Linux computer, for example. This gets wildly different reactions depending on which conference I'm at. So this one was medium, yeah. But if we plot these on our graph, we'll see that it's fairly consistent, right? In all of our different domains, this is a fairly consistent principle. Now, the question here again being, should the pilots have known about MCAS? Where are they on this graph, and is it a complex enough system that they need to be trained on it? Maybe. Boeing didn't think so. They concluded that there would be little risk in the event of an MCAS failure, in part because of an FAA-approved assumption that the pilots would respond to an unexpected activation in a mere 3 seconds. At the same time, Boeing and the FAA agreed not to inform the pilots about MCAS in the manuals, even though their safety analysis expected the pilots to be able to address the issue if there was a problem. So we're going to say that within 3 seconds of an issue occurring, the pilots are going to fix it, but the pilots don't know what they're fixing or how to fix it. Yeah, so that was the problem here, as you can see. Next question, how do you ensure that users know what is happening in your complex system? In this case, how do you make sure that the pilots know that what is happening is not an aerodynamics issue, it's not a problem with your flight control surfaces or your hydraulics or anything, it is a problem with the flight control computer? How do you tell them that? How do you let them know what they need to do about it? And this is an extremely difficult question to answer, particularly in these complex systems, because in many cases we have this issue of cascading failures, where we have one system breaks, and you'll make an alert about that. But the MCAS happening causes the plane to drop into a dive, which activates a different alert system, which causes the plane to come close to terrain, which activates a different alert system. And you have this cascading set of alerts of different priorities that it's very difficult to let your pilot know what is the root cause that they actually need to address. And I have a couple of videos here to show you just how complex that can get. These are from simulators, not from real flights, but they give you an idea of what's going on.
That's stall alarm. Over the next 4.5 minutes, the stall warning will sound 75 times.
So this is from a different flight that I think was in 2009, but it gives you an idea of how those alarms can be really interfering. Right? Like those are so loud that those pilots can barely communicate with each other effectively, trying to figure out what's going on. And they are very distracting from what you're trying to do. Here's another example.
You can fly it. Terrain. You can fly it. Terrain.
This thing's got long terrain. Now we can't.
Too low terrain. Too low terrain.
For 500 feet.
In this case, the alarm's going off because they have someone who is not a pilot flying this and he's crashing the airplane. But the point being, though, that the alarms, again, are very interfering. In this example, there are 2 alarms going off. In the 737 crashes, there were probably at least 4, maybe 5 or 6 different alarms going off at the critical points there. Trying to convey to the pilots what they need to do in that situation is extraordinarily difficult. And we know that this was an issue with these flights, right? They struggled to understand the cascade of warnings going on in their cockpits that happened as a result of these MCAS issues. Now, this is not a new concept, right? This is actually what I studied in my doctoral research, and this stuff started back in the 30s, 40s was really when it first picked up, when we started getting these very complex pieces of equipment like aircraft and spacecraft. And the FAA knows this, and this is written into law, right? And it's what we call written in blood, meaning that it is written into law because people died from it. Based on lessons learned from past airline accidents, the FAA regulations stipulate precise design details for the displays in their cockpits. They aim at ensuring 3 things. 1, that the pilots know what is going on when a malfunction occurs. 2, that it catches the attention of the pilots. And 3, that it averts possible confusion. Now, number 2, very easy to do, right? You make a loud sound and flash a bright light and you'll get someone's attention. But doing that in combination with 1 and 3 is very difficult. That's why we have regulations for it, and there are plenty of design guidelines on how to achieve this. But in 2014, Boeing convinced the FAA to relax the safety standards for the new 737 MAX related to the cockpit alerts that would warn pilots if something went wrong. Their argument for this, why they said they needed the exemption, was because it would be too expensive to bring the old 737 airframe up to modern standards, and therefore they shouldn't have to do it. You don't get away with that in most industries, right? You don't get to renovate an old building and gut it and completely redo it and then say, I'm not going to comply with fire safety regulations. Okay, next topic, manual overrides. We talked a little bit about this, about how the humans here had a way to disable MCAS, but not really. And so to talk about this, we talk about levels of automation. And if you go through the literature, you'll find a dozen different scales of automation, ranging from 3 to 20 different levels, depending on who's writing it. But I've distilled it down into what I think are the core 5. The first one being no automation at all, right? You don't have an automated system. Level 2 is a system that provides helpful information to the user. A good example being Google Maps. You tell it where you want to go, it tells you what you should do, but actually doing it is up to you. The third level is automatic control when directed by a human, like cruise control. I turn the automation on, I turn the automation off, and in the meantime, in between those, it drives my car for me to some extent. Level 4 being automatic control unless directed by a human, such as Windows Update. It will do its thing, and it will restart your computer in the middle of a talk unless you tell it not to. And level 5 being automatic control without a human override. And we don't see these very often because there aren't a lot of systems here that have some sort of life-critical impact where there isn't a big red emergency stop button that you can push to turn it off. But we do see it in remote spacecraft, as an example. If you consider the New Horizons probe that took a bunch of amazing photos of Pluto and Charon, those spacecraft, the latency is 9+ hours. So of course, once that has started, there is no way a human can interfere or intervene because it would take 9 hours for the command to get to the spacecraft. So the question here being, did MCAS have a manual override? And there isn't really a clear answer to that because in one sense, yes, you could turn off that stabilizer cutout switch and that would disable MCAS. But you can't disable the automation without also entirely disabling your power assist, which is a necessary component. So does that really count as an override? I don't really think it does. How about redundancy? I think if anyone here does systems engineering, you'll certainly see the redundancy failure in this design. Remember that we have 2 angle of attack sensors, and each of them is connected to one of the 2 flight control computers, and one of the 2 flight control computers is active at a given time. They were actually able to retrieve the data off of one of those flight data recorders from one of the flights and saw what happened here, which is why we know that the sensor was the problem. The left sensor, which was connected to the active flight control computer, partway into the flight, something happened. Probably a bird hit the sensor or otherwise broke it, and it started reading essentially a max value for the rest of the flight. And that is the data that was being fed into the MCAS algorithm on the computer that was active, and that, in turn, drove the stabilizer. So the point here being, we don't ever want to let a critical system have a single point of failure. In this case, even though there were 2 sensors and there were 2 flight control computers, only one of them was active at a time, and there was no automated failover. There was nothing that recognized that problem and switched to the backup. And there was nothing that the pilots could do to manually change what MCAS was doing or to manually change the source of the sensor data. We also don't want to let one broken sensor affect good sensors. I've certainly seen some designs like this. I work with IoT equipment and a lot of embedded sensors and things. And I've seen designs where you will average sensor data over a couple sensors to try to improve the accuracy. Well, if you look at that graph that I just showed, right, even if you average those 2 sensors together, that is still going to cause MCAS to activate and cause exactly the same problems. That wouldn't have saved us. So what do you do if you have 2 different sensors that disagree? Well, preferably, if you have the money and the space for it, you add a 3rd sensor and you do some sort of voting mechanism, which is the way a lot of distributed systems work in computer science. Alternatively, maybe you could force a manual override. You could detect that the 2 different sensors are reading different data and tell the pilots, well, there's a problem, I'm going to turn off the automation and let you take control. But this leads to something called mode confusion, which is when the pilot doesn't know, or the operator of the system in general doesn't know what is happening. What is my system doing? So imagine you're flying along over the ocean and you're working on some navigation task while your plane is on autopilot, and all of a sudden the autopilot turns off and you're like, what's the deal? Why did that happen? Yes, there will be a log somewhere, a notification somewhere telling you what just happened, but you have to go digging to go see it, and you it really interferes with your situational awareness. How about change management? This one is particularly interesting in this case because there are some more details here that I didn't tell you about. So MCAS was something that came in because the test pilots initially found the problem with that plane pitching up on its own. But after Boeing added MCAS, the pilots said, hey, that actually makes the plane nicer to fly. Let's get more of that. Give me more MCAS. And so they said, we want this to apply during the takeoff phase, because they noticed that during takeoff, the plane had a tendency to pitch up more than the previous generations. So they said, apply this to takeoff, and it'll help with that stability as well. Because originally, it was designed only to do this during the cruise phase of flight when the plane is moving fairly fast up in the air. But the problem is that because this is a different use case, there are different parameters. And for example, the original version of MCAS was activated only if there were two different distinct sensors that indicated it was necessary. A high angle of attack, which is what we talked about, and a high G-force. Because a high G-force implies that both there is a high angle of attack and the aircraft itself is actually responding to it by pitching up fairly quickly. But because there are no excessive G-forces at low speed during takeoff, the engineers removed the G-force factor as a trigger, but that meant the MCAS was only activated by a single angle of attack sensor. The other thing about a low speed is that when you're moving slowly, there's less air moving across the control surfaces. When there's less air moving across the control surface, you have to rotate the control surface further to have the same effect, because the force that it applies is a factor of the rotation times the airspeed. So when the planes later entered service, MCAS was capable of moving the tail, the stabilizer, more than 4 times further than was stated in the initial safety analysis documents. So they made this change to allow it to function during takeoff, but they never redid the safety analysis. I would think that someone might catch that, but apparently that was not a priority. But it is something we absolutely need to keep in mind when we're making changes. When we have those small little change tickets coming in from our clients, it's like, oh, it's just a little patch. No, that could actually affect a lot of different things, and we really need to analyze what that could do. Retiring a system is a good one, because I think anyone here who's been in the industry at least a decade will have at some point worked on a legacy system. And I mean like legacy, Fortran, COBOL kind of stuff. And when you're working with these things, and a company's keeping them around because they're insanely expensive to try to replace or rebuild, well, you're working with spaghetti code that's been patched over 4 decades. There isn't anyone working there anymore who truly understands what it's doing, and you're trying to narrow down your change just so it affects this one tiny little thing so you don't have to deal with the rest of the system. That's surprisingly common. In this case, Boeing realized that was a problem, right? They said the 737 MAX is now 40 to 50 years old. It is time to build a new design. Time to scrap that airframe and start fresh. Because of market pressures and competition from Boeing, they changed their minds later and said, no, we're going to push this a little bit further and get one more iteration out of it. And that was one of the key factors of what drove these incidents. Corporate culture, I think, is pretty important to talk about too. We are engineers and developers, but that means we work for a client or an employer, and usually a manager of some level who tells us what we need to do and says this is priority and this is not. That's really what happened here. Some of these issues were reported, but management said, shove that under the rug, we're not going to deal with it. We're actually going to dock your pay from your bonus if you keep reporting issues, and forget about it and move on. Now, one would think that after those first 2 crashes, Boeing might have learned its lesson. Perhaps it would stop doing things a little unsafely. Perhaps it might put a little more care into its engineering practices and its safety assessments. Perhaps it might try to prevent a small child from falling out the side of an airplane in midair. In this case, it was the parent who prevented the child from falling out of the plane by making sure his seatbelt was fastened and tight and holding him down. Perhaps Boeing might say, there are some risks associated with this. Maybe we'll be a little more on the up and up. Or maybe not. Maybe instead we'll plead guilty to criminal charges. And this brings me to my final point, which is that in some level, it falls to us. In many ways, we are the last line of defense against something actually making it out into the world. How many times have you done something and said, this is prototype code, this is for development only, this is not to go into production, and 6 months later, it is out in production? Yeah, you all know it's true. right? So that means that if we don't stop it, there's a good chance that no one else will. And that is what happened here. The engineers found that this was an issue, they raised the concerns, they were told to do it anyways, and they did it anyways. And what I can guarantee you, if I don't tell you anything else definitive here, what I can guarantee you is that you do not want to feel like some of those engineers did after those 2 plane crashes happened. It's not something that's going to need to apply to your next WordPress install, but anytime you're working on a critical system, and like I said, I think a lot more of you do than you might realize, it absolutely needs to be considered. And with that, I want to thank you very much for your time. And here is my LinkedIn. Feel free to send me a message if you want to talk about this, or an email. I also want to note that when I come to these conferences, a lot of people, after the talks, ask me like, "Hey, how do I get into speaking at events? How do I get up on the stage?" And I won't argue it. It's a lot of work and time, but it is something that anyone here can do. And so, if you are interested in that, feel free to send me an email or message on LinkedIn, and I'm happy to go over notes with you about a talk idea you have, or maybe a presentation you've done, and provide some feedback if you're interested. Thank you very much.